What's going on, fam? Welcome back to the ride to the Dr. Eric K. Coleman Show. Please do me a favor, ma'am and sir. Click the like tab, the notification tab, so that you can stay abreast to all things pertaining to this platform. And most of all, please click the subscribe tab. Today, what we are going to be talking about as we spring into a new month of April concerning relationships. Today's episode is going to come from a gentleman by the name of Sean Teef. He's going to be talking about I believe, one of the most important chapters in alignment to my book, Paradigm Thinking Different About Relationships, is the gap between perception and reality. We all can create our own reality as to what we think things are when we do not take time to consider the reality of things or the totality or looking at it from a holistic perspective. And that's what I deal with in chapter 7 of the book. And Mr. Sean here, as he anchors this TED Talk, is going to dive a bit deeper into this topic or this idea concerning perception versus reality, which I think is a very critical thing when we talk about this idea of relationships. No matter what perspective we have to deal in the reality, because we are setting ourselves up for failure when we are constantly thinking and looking at things from the perspective of just our perception and not taking things for what they are or face value. So let's go ahead and jump into the TED Talk.
I'm going to tell you a story. It's a short one, I promise. But what I want you to do is I want you to picture it in your mind as I tell it, okay? Bob went to the beach to play fetch with his dog. That's it. I told you it was short. But here's my question for you. When you pictured it in your mind, what kind of dog did Bob have? Now, what the research says is you probably pictured one of 3 dogs. Either 1, you pictured your dog. 2, you pictured a Labrador Retriever. Or 3, you pictured a Golden Retriever. And the reality is, that kind of makes sense, right? Maybe you pictured your dog because, well, when you think dog, that's the reference point you have for dog. But the research says if you didn't picture yours, you probably pictured a Labrador Retriever or a Golden Retriever. Why? Well, kind of makes sense because I told you that he went to the beach to play fetch with his dog. And what do Labrador Retrievers do? What do Golden Retrievers do? It's right there in the name. They retrieve things. So if he went to play fetch, that's what he brought. There's a concept in rhetorical studies called linguistic or listening fidelity. And what listening fidelity is it's how close did I get with my message to what you pictured in your head. Now, you pictured a Golden Retriever. Bob doesn't have a Golden Retriever. No, Bob has a mixed breed. It's half wolf, half Chihuahua.
I want to stop right there. He says something key. When we say certain things, what is the perception that pops into your brain based off of your upbringing, your life experiences, your lived experiences, your culture? What things do you hear or do you see or do you perceive when you hear things? So when we talk about things concerning relationships and love, when you're springing into these new relationships and you want to throw out the word love, what does that mean to you? Are we entering into relationships with the same perspective as I think we are monogamous, or we are in a committed relationship, or we love each other, or we are exclusive? Have we taken the time to take a self-respective look or have this conversation with other people to figure out, does my definition of these words align with the other person when I hear it? So when people say that we're dating, does that automatically mean to somebody that we're exclusive? So we got to have those conversations to figure out, what is your perception of these words or these images that pop into your brain when you hear certain terminologies?
It's a wolf wawa. That's what he's got. But you didn't picture that. No, 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 you didn't. There's a gap between what you pictured and what he's got. There's a gap between perception and between reality.
Absolutely.
I first started thinking about the gap and this idea of a gap when I spent time in London, and I went to the London Underground, which is just a fancy European way of saying subway, and I saw signs everywhere. They reminded me to mind the gap. Now here they're talking about the platform and the train. There's a little spot there, and they don't want you to twist your ankle or anything, which is smart. I think that there's a lot of good advice that be had in train stations. In Japan, for example, you might see a sign that says, take care of head, and that's smart. But that's not what we're talking about right now. No, what we're talking about now is the gap. You should mind the gap. Because between perception and between reality, there's a gap.
Yeah. Yep.
Those gaps can be dangerous. Might twist an ankle. Might do more harm.
What he's getting at here is really critical. There is danger when we don't mind the gap, when we don't pay attention to what is not said, when we don't pay attention to the perception, and when we create this perception as it being reality. And to his point with his example, if you don't mind that gap, you could create in your mind that there is no gap, and I'm going to step in this hole, I'm going to hurt myself because you are not addressing reality. So that's really the danger when we talk about relationships, that we cannot dwell in perception and stay there. And that's where we get our feelings hurt. That's where we get heartbroken, because we expected one thing when we never communicated to the other person what the reality was.
I've heard someone else. So let's talk for a minute about the dangers of the gap and maybe what we can do to overcome those dangers. There's a South Asian parable that you might have heard before. It's where a series of blind men they get experience to an elephant. They've never experienced an elephant before, and they're asked to describe what an elephant is. But each one of the men is only allowed a certain part to the elephant. So one of the blind men touches the side of the elephant, right? He's like, oh, I know what an elephant is like. It's like a wall. Another gets access to the leg. He's like, no, 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 no. Elephant, it's like a pillar.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have heard this.
Says, no, it's like a rope. Or the tusk, it's a pipe. And the point, of course, here is that none of the blind men by themselves really understand what an elephant is, because they only have kind of a limited perspective. They have limited access to what the elephant is. There's a gap.
Yeah.
There's a gap between perception and between reality. And in rhetorical studies, again, there are theorists who talk about this gap between perception and between reality. And what they say is that we all experience the gap, because when we're born, we are born into a culture, to a series of cultural narratives, or master narratives. So theorists like Kenneth Burke or theorists like Edwin Black say that when we are born into stories that precede us, these giant master narratives, that we take these cultural narratives, this rhetoric of narrative, and we then spin out our own personal stories through it. And your personal stories oftentimes are reflective of the master narratives that you are born into. Althusser says that we are hailed by ideology. That, again, is the perception that you're born into, which then is separate and distinct from reality. And what do we have to do? Well, we must always mind the gap.
And I want to stop there for a second and expound on the point that he was talking about, the elephant, to where the blind gentlemen were touching various parts of the elephant, which he is going to dig a bit deeper into that example, which aligns with chapter 7, your perception is not always reality, in the book. And the first exercise on the first page that pops up that I communicate here, and it says, take 30 seconds to observe the picture below. Simply take in the photo. Do not try to draw conclusion to what it is happening. Allow your mind to fixate on the image. And so the whole exercise here is to try to gather what's happening here. But then on the following page, I present the big picture idea here As to when you see the big picture, you get a better perspective of what's going on. And the visual is from a 1946 coined phrase from John Haywood: you can't see the forest for the trees. So when we are fixated on one little thing or one thing in a relationship, and we allow that to create the narrative or allow it to create the perspective for the entire relationship, we cannot see the entire relationship in its totality of what's being presented in front of us and what the relationship actually entails, or quite frankly, where we stand in the relationship, because we are picking and choosing, we're cherry picking what we want to focus on, and we are not taking into consideration the totality of the relationship. So when people tell you certain things in a relationship in the beginning, well, I just want to be friends. I'm not ready for a relationship. I just want to date right now. I've been hurt before. We really take those things into consideration, or we're constantly fixated, well, I want this person, so I'm going to make them mine. They're going to be my boyfriend or girlfriend. I'm going to be with this person long term. And we get our feelings hurt because the emotional attachment is not reciprocated. But did we take into consideration to mind the gap? What is the gap here between reality and perception? That's what we're dealing with here on today.
Virtually every discipline talks about the gap. They, in one way or another, they all see it, they all perceive it, they all know it's there. Even in the hard sciences, with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, we can know one thing without having to know another. There's a gap in what we have access to, in what we can know. In rhetorical studies, it's the master narrative versus your personal stories. All those things, they're also very, very careful that we have to be able to mind the gap. But that doesn't always sit really well with me. Because if we mind the gap, and we are aware there's a difference between perception and between reality, it seems to suggest that we can have access at some point to reality. So in some versions of that South Asian parable, there's another man who walks up and says, here is what the elephant looks like, and describes for each of the men, here is what the elephant looks like in its totality.
He's got the perspective, the right perspective.
Of course, the man who walks up is deaf, so he'll never hear the elephant bellow.
Reality.
Can't have access to reality. So I don't like this idea of minding the gap. Rather, I want to do something different. I want to mine the gap, because I think there's something there that we can get out of the gap that can help us avoid that danger. And it's going to sound silly, and it's going to sound absurd, but I also think it'll work. What can we do to mine the gap as opposed to mind the gap? One of my favorite films is from 1993. It's a film called Falling Down. It stars Michael Douglas and Robert Duvall. And in it, Michael Douglas is a man who rails against what he believes to be the absurd. So ultimately what happens is he goes into a fast food restaurant and wants to get breakfast.
He's talking some good things here that we can really apply to on a practical and daily level.
And he wants breakfast, but they stop serving at 10:30. And they say, I'm sorry, they can't. And he says, but I can see right there you have breakfast still under the heat lamps. Just serve me that. And they say, we can't, it's against the rules. So what happens in the film, it's kind of a sad tale actually, is he has a break and he snaps and he begins railing against the absurd. He begins railing against what he believes to be the reality as it exists. But what he's really railing against is his own perception.
And that drives us into our next point here, to when you allow your perception to become the reality. So remember, in the beginning, we're talking about the gap or the disillusion between dwelling in your perception and not facing the reality. But here's the even more dangerous part of when you have adopted your perception as the reality. So let's see what he has to say about this. And this is where, the rubber meets the road, of where it gets a lot of people in trouble, to where not only are we perceiving things differently, we're perceiving things to be a certain way, but we are operating in those perceptions as if they are reality. And so that means that you are so far disconnected and delusional from the reality. And that's where we see a lot of these mishaps in relationships, because people are walking in realities as opposed
And
to
that's the
what
danger of the gap.
I'm sorry, they are not
Which
walking
is
in
that
realities
if you
as
believe that you
opposed
have
to what
access
they
to
believe their
reality, at some
perception
point
is.
you then can get a monopoly on truth. Now, I said that from these master narratives, you spin out your own personal stories, and you do.
And I'm sorry, this is for another conversation, but don't get me started when he's talking about truth here. Don't get me started on when people talk about truth is your own perspective, and to whereas truth is relative and not objective. So we're really treading on thin ice, and I know I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but we are getting in hot water when this narrative now that is created in our culture that speak your truth and your truth is reality. Well, no, your truth is not reality all the time. Yes, it is your truth. I acknowledge your truth, and your truth is what you feel that it is, and that is very, you know, we acknowledge that. I acknowledge that. However, your perception is still at the root context, not the reality. So you can't hold people accountable for something that is not reality. It's just your perception. So we really got to tread very thin. We got to tread very lightly on that when we talk about people's subjective truth. Again, you have every right, every human right to feel a way that you want to feel about something, but it does not, at the end of the day, make it reality.
But when those personal stories you believe to be the only representation of reality, in my own personal story, in my own personal movie, I'm always the hero.
Yep.
And if my perception of reality is different from yours,
Yep.
and I'm the hero,
Yep.
then you've got to be the villain.
Yep.
And if you're the villain, then I fight against you.
Absolutely, sir.
The difference between perception
dangerous.
and between reality. If my perception is different from yours and I'm right, then you're wrong.
Yeah.
But in Falling Down, at the very end of the film, spoiler alert, at the very end of the film, Michael Douglas is standing there, and Robert Duvall is the cop who's been chasing him the whole time. He has a gun pointed at him, and Michael Douglas has this revelation. He says, wait, I'm the bad guy? Yeah. We don't ever kind of come to that realization because we're always the hero, because we think we have a monopoly on truth, because we think...
Boom. He just summed everything up here. He said, we think we have a monopoly on truth. You know the board game Monopoly. If you land on a certain place, you got these cars, you got the money, you can buy the real estate, and you can put the houses and apartments and whatever on it. And when people land on it, they have to pay you because they are taking up residence on something that you own. We think we have the monopoly on truth, on relationships, that our perspective is always correct. We think that we are always right. And if somebody goes against the grain of what we believe to be true in our own world of thinking, then the other person is automatically the enemy because they are not seeing things the way that we see it, because we have interpreted it a certain way. It's our perception, it's our perspective, and if you don't see it the way that I see it, then you are the enemy and you are against me. You don't love me, you don't like me, all these various things. And so that was that was very powerful. That was hard right there. That is a very hard truth of what he just said, that we think that we have a monopoly on truth. That's powerful.
That we know what reality is. So how do we mine the gap to avoid that from happening, from kind of hardening into that nodal point where we have reality and we alone have it? Be absurd. Instead of Michael Douglas railing against what he perceives to be absurd, I want you to embrace the absurd. Listening fidelity. The wolf wawa. You pictured a dog that was not a wolf wawa. You know what you didn't picture? I know you didn't picture this. You didn't picture a dump truck. I think maybe you kind of should. So let's do my story again. And this time I want you to not picture a dog. I want you to picture, I'm still going to say dog, I want you to picture a dump truck. We got it? Bob went to the beach to play fetch with his dog. Now, you pictured a dump truck at the beach. It's absurd. But the reality is this, that dump truck is just a placeholder. Just like the golden retriever you pictured was just a placeholder, the dump truck is just a placeholder. So you still got the context of the story. You still understand, we're still communicating. You still understand what I'm trying to say. The difference is that there is this glaring point in your mind that is absurd, that is a constant reminder to you that you are only seeing the world through your individual perceptions, because that's all we're ever able to do. And when there's a constant reminder that all I'm doing is perceiving the world my way, not the real way, just my way, then I can have empathy for others. I still don't have access to reality because none of us ever do, but I'm more empathetic. There is a gap between perception and reality, but there's something very, very special in the middle, in that gap. There's also a pretty big gap between a wolf and a chihuahua, but when those two things come together, something special can happen too. That's what I want for you. Embrace the absurd. Be the wolf wawa. Thank you.
That was pretty good. I will say I did enjoy his TED Talk. He was very pointed. He was very to the point. It was really good. I cannot complain about this one. I really liked his approach. He was spot on. He was dead on. He really, what's the word I want to say? He really captured what essence of what we've been talking about here on this platform concerning perception versus reality, again in chapter 7 of the book. Please, if you haven't already, please, ma'am, please, sir, support and get it. I promise you it will bless your life in regards to reframing and shaping your thought process concerning relationships. So with that being said, we really need to make sure that we are doing the self-evaluation concerning relationships and on ourselves, that we are not just dwelling in this fictitious flight of fancy thought process concerning my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, my perspective only, that we have this monopoly on truth. That if your perspective does not align with what I am thinking and what I am perceiving, then you are the villain, you are wrong, you are bad, you don't love me, you don't support me. That is totally far from the truth. And so when we do this self-reflective work on ourselves, when we take the deep dive, we then understand better how we show up in relationships and how to properly engage. And when we properly engage in relationships, we then are able to, from a positive perspective, impact our homes, our family, our community, society, our nation, and we can take this thing global. And so until next time, please, fam, continue to think differently about relationships. Peace.